I don't think it's too controversial a statement to suggest that remakes and reboots are fairly reviled and looked down upon in general, but several of my favourite films of all time are in fact remakes. So what makes these remakes good, and why are most remakes worthless piles of cash grab trash? Well, I think this week's movie, The Blob, embodies all the rules I think filmmakers should follow if doing a remake. The first rule of Remake Club is wait to make your remake. The longer the wait, the better. I'd say 25 to 30 years is probably the sweet spot for a remake to happen. Just long enough, but not too long, that people around to remember the first are still alive, and maybe willing to go watch the remake, and long enough that people not born or who were children when the original was released are now grown-ups. If it's a film aimed at an adult audience, or if it is aimed at children, it's possible that people who were children when the original was released have grown up and have children of their own who they might like to take to the cinema for a bit of a childhood nostalgia hit they can share with their kids. The Blob falls right at the end of this period, being made exactly 30 years prior to the original of the same name released in 1958. A film that was a box office B-movie success, earning $4 million at the box office on a shoestring budget of $110,000, but wasn't exactly a beloved and treasured masterpiece of film, which brings us to the second rule of Remake Club. Don't remake beloved classics. Now, it's probably really tempting to want to remake a classic because they have a built-in audience and name recognition, whereas movies that aren't so well beloved probably have neither of those things going for them. And although it probably sounds fairly trite to say this, beloved classics are beloved and considered classics for a reason, that usually being that people recognize these movies as being very good and they have some emotional attachment to them as a result. Meaning any changes you make are going to disappoint at best and anger at worst a huge amount of people, and it's incredibly hubristic to think you can catch lightning in a bottle twice and make a remake that is even better than the beloved classic original, which is why I think it is much better to remake a well-regarded but not exactly beloved title such as The Blob, which even when it was released wasn't entirely highly regarded, as we can see from this contemporary review from the New York Times. Unfortunately, this picture talks itself to death. Even with The Blob nibbling away at everybody in sight, and most of the trick effects under the direction of Irvin S. Yeworth Jr. look pretty phony. The acting is pretty terrible itself. There is not a single becomingly familiar face in the cast, headed by young Stephen McQueen. Meaning by the late 1980s, if The Blob was remembered at all, it was remembered as a fairly chortle-worthy, cheesy example of 1950s low-budget sci-fi, whose special effects really date it badly, which brings us to our third rule of Remake Club. That being, it is preferable that some technological, cultural, or stylistic shift has taken place that means the film can be brought up to date for modern audiences. For example, a lot of films from the past have a certain style of acting that is pretty cheesy and amusing to more modern audiences, and would in fact put many people off watching and enjoying these movies. In the case of The Blob, it's a twofer, because not only is the acting in the original very 1950s, so are the special effects. Take a look at this death scene from the 1958 original. It's laughably lame by late 1980s standards. A remake of The Blob has some great special effects, however. The Blob can actually be a star of its own movie as a result. We get quite a few old school style deaths with this one, I think highlighting perfectly what the passage of 30 years can do for a film in terms of special effects. Originally, the man is seemingly killed off camera, with the camera just zooming in towards his face, then cutting to another scene. But within a minute, we pan up to see this glorious monstrosity stuck to the ceiling. The Blob 1988 has some great examples of late 80s special effects. They use every trick that Hollywood had hitherto devised up to that point to try and make the Blob come to life. The aforementioned trick seems to be a practical effect, basically a rubber, possibly animatronic suit. Others I don't know for a fact, but appear to use stop motion, puppetry, forced perspective, models, good old-fashioned pyrotechnics, and then compositing all those together to get the job done. Some of the compositing does now look aged with the advent of digital compositing and CGI, but I think if you are a lover of practical effects, then the Blob remake is an absolute treat. That throws up a bunch of very gory, just magnificent to watch deaths. Which brings us to our fourth and final rule of Remake Club: create your own identity. In other words, stick to the core of the original, but make the remake either different in tone, style, or even genre. The 1988 remake of The Blob does this in various ways. Firstly, it subverts the audience's expectations. The first act of the film introduces us to a number of teenage and adult characters. Paul Taylor, a star high school football player who is going out on his first date with cheerleader Meg Penny.
Daddy, I'd like you to meet my friend Paul.
Ripped.
A bit of an aside, but this introduction to a father is possibly one of the greatest scenes in cinematic history. The police chief, and a very young Kevin Dillon's character Brian Flagg, who is a rebel without a cause. How do we know that? Well, we are introduced to him drinking beer, riding a motorcycle, and wearing a leather jacket. It's movie script writing 101. We as an audience already know the good guys and the bad guys in this little town. We also see a homeless bum, who unsurprisingly is our first victim of the Blob. When he sees the meteor carrying the alien slime to Earth, he rather foolishly sticks his hand right in there and ends up a melted pool of goo in the hospital. So far, our expectations are entirely met, so how exactly does it subvert our expectations? Paul is obviously analogous to Steve McQueen's character from the original film, who is the hero of that flick's narrative, and he's also the person that most people would expect to be the hero of this. A teen star high school jock football player who saves the day is a literal cliche character from this genre of flick. So it comes as a massive surprise, or would if they hadn't literally put it on the VHS cover, when Act 1 ends with his death. And not just any death. No, Paul gets the most iconic death, the most gruesome and disgusting one in the entire film. He doesn't just die, we literally see him suffer whilst he dies. So that's the first way the film diverts from the original and creates its own identity. It makes the female, who in most 50s sci-fi would be little more than eye candy, the ultimate hero, along with the bad boy rebel, whilst the characters we'd usually see be the heroes in these kinds of flicks die one by one. The second way the Blob remake creates its own style and tone is the fact this film is a conspiracy theory flick, more in keeping with the more cynical views of the late 1980s than the aspirational and hopeful ones of the 50s. With the original having the Blob being an actual alien creature from space, brought to Earth by chance by a meteor, in the remake it is now a US government biological weapon that was shot into space as an experiment to see what would happen with the government showing up, not to help the locals stop and kill the Blob, but to capture it, and use it as a weapon they can use to gain the upper hand in the continuing Cold War with the Soviets. The film has also changed subtly from being a more campy 1950s sci-fi with horror elements to being a straight-up horror with sci-fi elements. I love the Blob remake and think it is a far superior film to the original, which is at this point even more dated than it was when the remake was made, and I'd go as far as to say almost unwatchable to a modern audience. The remake brings us a really young-looking Kevin Dillon. It successfully subverts your expectations, updates the tone of the film for the age it was made, and delivers a whole bunch more of what you want from these kinds of films, namely action, gore, and the actual Blob. That isn't enough to convince you. They kill off a date rapist, and the worst crime of all, a man who talks throughout a movie at the theatre, which is always satisfying. Hell, we even get what has to be one of the most American scenes ever. A bunch of dudes just firing into a manhole cover, then blowing the hell out of the sewer system with a bomb. What I'm trying to say is you could do much worse than sticking the remake of The Blob on and just being hella entertained for 95 minutes. Oh, and Hollywood, you may have noticed that the 1988 remake is 25 years old this year, which puts it right in my sweet spot for a remake, and I think it probably also falls neatly into the other 3 rules of Remake Club too. I'm just going to leave that suggestion out there if you're stuck for ideas. Let me know down in the comments what your rules for remakes would be. Like this video if you enjoyed it, dislike it if you didn't, and maybe even subscribe to the channel, cause I get myself a dopamine hit when number goes up.